The funniest thing about private property is that people always respect it right after they finally believe the warning sign. The first sound that shattered the quiet Saturday morning was not a shout or an argument. It was the unmistakable chorus of half a dozen geese announcing that someone had wandered exactly where they should not have been. Their loud honking echoed across my backyard, bounced off the wooden privacy fence, and drifted into the neighboring subdivision while a startled man froze in the middle of my lawn with both hands raised and an expression that looked far more confused than frightened. Just beyond him stood a bright red metal sign bolted securely beside my gate. It read, "Enter at your own risk." I took another sip of coffee from my porch without saying a word because everything happening in front of me was unfolding exactly the way I expected. The security cameras mounted beneath the roofline quietly recorded every second from 3 different angles. My name is Ethan Walker, and despite what certain people in the Homeowners Association would later claim, I never invited anyone into my backyard, never encouraged anyone to ignore my fences, and certainly never promised that my geese would welcome unexpected visitors. The birds belonged there because it was their home. I belonged there because I owned the property. The only people who did not seem to understand that simple arrangement were the neighbors who had convinced themselves my yard was somehow a public shortcut. For years they crossed my grass to save barely 2 minutes of walking around the block. Some climbed over the low decorative fence before I replaced it. Others squeezed through the side gate after forgetting to close it behind them. Parents sent children across the yard with bicycles. Dog walkers wandered through while talking on their phones as though they were strolling through a public park instead of someone's backyard. Delivery drivers occasionally followed the same path after watching residents do it repeatedly. At first, I assumed people simply made honest mistakes. I politely introduced myself whenever I noticed someone crossing the property and explained that the yard was private. Most apologized with embarrassed smiles before leaving. Then the same faces appeared again the following week. Eventually, I installed clearer property markers. I added fresh landscaping along the boundary, repaired the fence, and locked the gate. None of it lasted very long because someone always found another excuse to cut across the grass. The strange part was that an actual sidewalk already connected every street inside the neighborhood. Using it required only a slightly longer walk. Convenience, however, seemed to outweigh common sense for a surprising number of people. Things changed after Karen Mitchell became president of the Homeowners Association. She spoke confidently about improving neighborhood accessibility and encouraging stronger community connections. Those ideas sounded perfectly reasonable until one afternoon she casually suggested that opening my backyard as a permanent walking path would benefit everyone. I laughed because I honestly believed she was joking. She was not. Standing there on my porch months later, listening to another wave of determined honking while my cameras captured every detail beneath the morning sun, I realized Karen still believed my answer would eventually change. What she did not know was that I had already spent weeks preparing the most peaceful, completely legal, and surprisingly memorable response she would ever receive. My backyard had never been designed to impress anyone. It was simply the place where I relaxed after long workdays, drank coffee before sunrise, tended a small vegetable garden, and cared for the animals that had slowly become part of my daily routine. The geese arrived years before any disagreement with the Homeowners Association. I had originally adopted 2 rescued birds from a nearby farm, and over time my little flock grew into 6 healthy geese that spent their days wandering between a shaded pond, open grass, and a fenced enclosure built specifically for them. They were noisy, curious, protective of their space, and completely predictable once you understood their behavior. Friends who visited regularly knew to speak calmly, move slowly, and avoid surprising them. The geese usually ignored anyone who respected their territory. They became loud only when strangers unexpectedly wandered into the middle of their home. Every morning followed almost the same routine. I filled fresh water containers, scattered grain near the pond, checked the fencing, and watched the birds march across the yard in a crooked line while sunlight filtered through the maple trees surrounding the property. The neighborhood beyond my fence gradually came to life as garage doors opened, children waited for school buses, and dog walkers followed the public sidewalks that already connected every street in the subdivision. Watching that quiet routine always reminded me why I bought the property in the first place. I wanted privacy without living miles away from town. Unfortunately, not everyone valued that same idea. The first people who crossed my backyard usually apologized after I politely explained that they had entered private property. I never raised my voice because honest mistakes happen. Then the same shortcuts appeared again and again. Worn paths slowly formed across my lawn where repeated foot traffic flattened healthy grass into narrow dirt trails leading from one side of the fence to the other. My freshly planted flower beds occasionally contained muddy footprints. Someone even left an empty coffee cup beside the pond one afternoon as though my backyard had become a public park. I responded the way I believed any reasonable homeowner would. I repaired damaged sections of the fence, installed additional boundary markers, trimmed landscaping to make property lines more visible, and placed small private property signs near every entrance people seemed determined to create. I also installed security cameras, not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted an accurate record whenever someone insisted they had permission to cross my yard. The cameras quietly documented everything without interfering with anyone's daily life. Most recordings showed exactly what I already suspected. Residents deliberately opened the side gate, crossed the lawn, and exited through another opening simply because it saved a short walk around the block. When Karen Mitchell became president of the Homeowners Association, those isolated incidents gradually transformed into something much more organized. During a neighborhood conversation, she casually mentioned that many residents appreciated using my backyard as a convenient connection between two streets. She described it as a community benefit rather than private trespassing. I smiled politely before explaining that my yard had never been dedicated as public access and that I intended to keep it exactly as it was. Karen listened with a pleasant expression, thanked me for my opinion, and walked away without arguing. At the time, I believed the conversation had ended. Looking back now, I realized it had actually become the beginning of a disagreement that would eventually convince me to rely on cameras, warning signs, and 6 remarkably observant geese instead of repeating the same polite conversation over and over again. The following week, an official letter from the Homeowners Association appeared inside my mailbox, printed on expensive stationery with the community logo embossed across the top. I carried it back to my porch, opened it beside my morning coffee, and quickly realized the friendly neighborhood conversation had quietly evolved into something much more formal. The letter stated that opening my backyard as a pedestrian connection would improve accessibility, strengthen community interaction, and benefit property owners throughout the subdivision. It even included a proposed diagram showing a walking path cutting directly across the center of my lawn before exiting through the opposite fence. The plan crossed the exact stretch of grass where my geese spent most afternoons wandering between the pond and their enclosure. It also passed only a few feet from the vegetable garden I had spent years building. I read the entire proposal twice before setting it aside. There was no offer to purchase an easement, no discussion about liability, no mention of maintenance, insurance, privacy, or property rights. It simply assumed I would eventually agree because the idea benefited everyone else. Later that evening, I attended the next Homeowners Association meeting after receiving an invitation to discuss the proposal. Karen Mitchell greeted me with a warm smile and thanked me for coming before presenting enlarged neighborhood maps on a projector screen. She explained that opening my yard would shorten walking distances by several hundred feet for dozens of residents each day. Several board members nodded approvingly, while others talked about encouraging healthier lifestyles through increased pedestrian access. When Karen finally asked for my thoughts, I stood and calmly explained that my property had never been intended to function as a public walkway. I enjoyed having neighbors, but I also enjoyed knowing my backyard remained exactly that, my backyard. I reminded everyone that a fully constructed public sidewalk already connected every street inside the subdivision and that no resident lacked safe access to any part of the neighborhood. The proposed shortcut offered convenience rather than necessity. Karen responded politely, suggesting that communities sometimes required small compromises for the greater good. I replied just as calmly that private ownership also existed for an important reason and that respecting property boundaries benefited every homeowner equally, including those attending the meeting. The discussion ended without raised voices, but I noticed several residents exchanging disappointed looks as I walked toward the parking lot. During the following days, my security cameras began recording something new. Instead of occasional individuals crossing the yard, small groups now used the shortcut together as though the proposal had already been approved. Parents pointed children toward the side gate. Dog walkers followed the same worn path across the grass. One afternoon, a neighbor even waved cheerfully while stepping through my unlocked gate carrying grocery bags, never stopping to ask permission. Every recording included a visible property marker and a closed gate that someone had deliberately opened before entering. I saved each video inside organized folders, adding dates and times without commenting publicly or confronting anyone. My goal was never to embarrass my neighbors. I simply wanted an accurate record of what was actually happening. As the collection of recordings steadily grew, I realized polite conversations alone were no longer changing anyone's behavior. If people continued treating clear boundaries as optional, I would need a solution that protected my property without creating conflict. Looking across the yard at 6 remarkably alert geese calmly patrolling their familiar territory, I quietly began thinking about an answer that relied entirely on common sense, clear warnings, and the simple expectation that adults should respect signs placed directly in front of them. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with a local attorney who specialized in property law because I wanted to make absolutely certain every decision I made would remain firmly within the law. I carried copies of my property survey, the recorded deed, recent homeowners association correspondence, and several folders containing security camera screenshots documenting repeated trespassing. After reviewing everything, the attorney leaned back in his chair and gave me advice that completely changed how I approached the situation. He explained that I had every right to protect my private property using lawful measures so long as I did not create unreasonable hazards or intentionally encourage confrontations. Clear boundary markers, security cameras, locked gates, and warning signs were all perfectly appropriate. My geese, he reminded me with a smile, were ordinary domestic animals living on my own property. Their natural territorial behavior did not become my legal responsibility simply because someone voluntarily ignored obvious warnings and entered their enclosure without permission. I thanked him, returned home, and spent the rest of the afternoon making careful improvements around the yard. I replaced aging fence boards, reinforced the side gate, adjusted the camera angles to eliminate blind spots, and installed brighter motion-activated lights near every entrance. Then I ordered a large weather-resistant metal sign with bold reflective lettering that could easily be seen from several yards away. When it arrived 2 days later, I mounted it directly beside the gate where nobody could reasonably claim they had missed it. The message was simple and impossible to misunderstand. Enter at your own risk. Private property. Do not enter without permission. I also added smaller signs along the fence reminding visitors that domestic geese occupied the enclosed yard. None of the signs contained threats. They simply described reality. Every afternoon, I continued my normal routine exactly as before. I fed the geese, cleaned the pond, maintained the vegetable garden, trimmed hedges, and answered work emails from the covered porch while the cameras quietly recorded everything happening around the property. The birds behaved exactly as they always had. They wandered through the grass, stretched their wings beside the pond, and loudly announced the arrival of squirrels, rabbits, delivery trucks, or unfamiliar visitors approaching the fence. Friends who entered through the front gate after calling ahead experienced nothing more dramatic than curious birds following them from a respectful distance. The geese recognized familiar faces because those visitors respected the animals and never wandered carelessly into their space. Unfortunately, my warning signs did not produce the reaction I expected from everyone. Most neighbors immediately stopped using the shortcut after seeing the new fencing and clearly posted notices. Others simply walked around the block using the public sidewalk exactly as they always could have. A small group, however, seemed convinced the signs existed only to discourage people who lacked confidence. My security cameras soon captured several residents standing outside the gate pointing toward the warning sign, while laughing before one of them casually reached for the latch anyway. Watching the footage later that evening, I realized the issue had never truly been about convenience. It had become a question of whether clearly expressed property rights deserved respect. I saved the recordings beside every previous video, organized them by date, and quietly waited because I knew the cameras would eventually capture the one moment that no argument, meeting, or letter would ever be able to explain away. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies, cool air, and the kind of peaceful quiet that usually settled over my backyard before the neighborhood fully woke up. I had just finished filling the Geese's water containers when my phone alerted me to movement near the side gate. Instead of walking outside immediately, I opened the live security camera feed on my tablet and watched from the porch. 3 residents stood outside the entrance studying the large warning sign I had installed only days earlier. One pointed directly at the bright red lettering while another laughed and shrugged as though the message had been written for someone else. They talked for another minute before the tallest man reached over, lifted the gate latch, and casually stepped inside my property. The other 2 followed without hesitation. They had not been invited. They had not knocked on my front door. They had simply decided that saving a short walk mattered more than respecting an obvious property boundary. For several seconds, nothing happened. The geese remained near the pond, quietly pecking at the grass beneath the maple trees. Then one of the birds noticed unfamiliar movement. Its head lifted. A sharp warning honk echoed across the yard. Within moments, the rest of the flock answered with loud calls of their own before quickly waddling toward the unexpected visitors in the confident, territorial manner they always displayed whenever strangers entered their enclosure. The 3 residents immediately stopped walking. Their relaxed smiles disappeared as the noisy flock continued approaching while flapping their wings and filling the quiet backyard with unmistakable honking. Nobody was touched. Nobody was trapped. The visitors simply looked at one another, turned around almost immediately, and hurried back toward the gate while trying to avoid drawing even more attention from the remarkably determined birds following several feet behind. From my porch, I watched the entire scene unfold exactly as nature intended. The geese behaved no differently than they had every day for years. They protected their familiar territory, announced unfamiliar activity, and escorted unexpected visitors toward the exit without ever leaving the boundaries of the yard. Once the gate closed behind the departing residents, the flock calmly returned to the pond as though nothing unusual had happened. I quietly saved the complete camera recording before returning to my coffee. Less than an hour later, another notification appeared on my phone. This time the camera captured Karen Mitchell standing outside the same gate with 2 homeowners association board members. They remained outside the fence, carefully reading every warning sign before discussing something among themselves. Karen pointed toward the cameras mounted beneath the roofline, then toward the geese resting peacefully beside the pond. After several minutes, they walked away without opening the gate. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had already begun talking about what happened. Some residents laughed about the unexpected encounter. Others admitted they had never realized the backyard was private property because so many people had treated it like a public shortcut for years. Several neighbors even stopped by my front porch, this time using the proper entrance, simply to apologize for previously crossing the yard without permission. Their honesty genuinely surprised me because it proved something important. Clear boundaries worked when people chose to respect them. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed that lesson. Before sunset, my email inbox received a message from the Homeowners Association requesting an emergency board meeting to discuss what Karen described as an unacceptable obstacle affecting community access. I smiled, opened the folder containing every security recording, every warning sign photograph, every property survey, and every previous letter, then quietly realized the conversation was finally about to move away from opinions and toward documented facts. The Emergency Homeowners Association meeting took place the following Tuesday evening inside the community clubhouse, and for the first time since this entire disagreement began, every seat in the room was occupied. Residents who had never attended a board meeting before quietly filled the back rows, curious to hear what would happen after the weekend incident spread through the neighborhood. Karen Mitchell opened the meeting with a calm but serious expression, explaining that several homeowners had expressed concerns about what she described as restricted neighborhood access. She then looked directly at me and asked whether I intended to remove what she called unnecessary obstacles from my backyard. I stood, thanked her for allowing me to speak, and placed a neatly organized binder on the table in front of the board. Inside were printed photographs of every warning sign, copies of my recorded property survey, the official deed establishing ownership, dated photographs showing the fence improvements, and security camera images documenting repeated trespassing over several months. I also included copies of every letter and email exchange between myself and the Homeowners Association. Before discussing anything else, I quietly asked one simple question. Can anyone here show me a recorded easement granting public access through my backyard? The room became completely silent. Karen glanced toward the association attorney seated beside her. He slowly reviewed the property documents already sitting in front of him before answering in an even voice that no recorded pedestrian easement existed. The only access available to every resident remained the public sidewalks already maintained throughout the subdivision. I then connected my laptop to the meeting room projector and played several short security recordings. Each video clearly showed the same sequence. Residents approached a locked gate. They stopped in front of large warning signs stating that the property was private and entry required permission. They deliberately opened the gate anyway before walking into the enclosed yard. Moments later, the geese naturally responded by loudly announcing unfamiliar visitors inside their territory, causing those individuals to turn around and leave. The recordings contained no shouting, no encouragement from me, no hidden surprises, and no actions designed to provoke the birds. The cameras simply documented people making their own decisions after ignoring multiple visible warnings. Several residents quietly nodded while watching the footage because they recognized familiar neighbors choosing convenience over common sense. One homeowner even stood and admitted that he had crossed my yard many times over the years without ever asking permission because everyone else seemed to do the same thing. His honesty changed the tone of the meeting almost immediately. The discussion gradually shifted away from blaming the geese and toward acknowledging that private property boundaries had been repeatedly ignored. The association attorney finally spoke again, explaining that domestic animals lawfully kept on private property did not create automatic liability simply because someone voluntarily entered clearly marked private land without authorization. He also reminded the board that property rights deserve the same respect they expected for every homeowner within the community. Karen remained quiet for several moments before asking whether I would consider discussing another solution if residents permanently stopped entering the yard without permission. I answered that I had wanted exactly that outcome from the very beginning. I never wanted arguments, complaints, or neighborhood division. I simply wanted my backyard to remain my backyard. As the meeting ended, several board members requested copies of my documentation for further review. Walking back to my truck beneath the cool evening sky, I noticed something I had not seen in months. Every resident leaving the clubhouse chose the public sidewalk instead of cutting across the edge of my property. Sometimes the strongest argument was not made by raising your voice. Sometimes it was quietly supported by photographs, recorded facts, and 6 remarkably observant geese that never once forgot where home began. 2 days after the meeting, I received a certified letter from the Homeowners Association instead of another demand. The envelope contained no accusations and no references to neighborhood access. Instead, it requested a formal mediation session with the association's attorney present so everyone could establish a permanent solution supported by property law rather than assumptions. I accepted immediately because that was exactly where I wanted the conversation to go. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived carrying the same organized binder that had quietly changed the tone of the previous discussion. Inside remained every property survey, recorded deed, security photograph, maintenance receipt for the fencing, copies of warning signs, email correspondence, and dozens of security camera screenshots documenting repeated unauthorized entries over several months. Nothing had been added for dramatic effect. Everything existed because I believed facts deserved better treatment than opinions. Karen Mitchell arrived a few minutes later accompanied by 2 board members and the association's legal counsel. She greeted me politely before we all took our seats around a long conference table inside a local mediation office. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from earlier meetings. Nobody spoke about shortcuts. Nobody argued that community convenience outweighed private ownership. Instead, the discussion focused on understanding exactly how the misunderstanding had continued for so many years. The mediator asked everyone to explain the situation from the beginning. I described how occasional trespassing gradually became routine, how repeated polite conversations changed nothing, how warning signs were ignored, and how my geese had simply continued behaving exactly as they always had inside their own enclosed yard. Karen admitted that many residents had viewed the worn footpath across my lawn as an unofficial neighborhood tradition rather than private property. She acknowledged that the association had never verified whether any legal easement actually existed before encouraging residents to continue using the shortcut. The association attorney then presented the results of an independent title search completed after the previous board meeting. Every recorded document confirmed the same conclusion. My backyard belonged entirely within my deeded property boundaries. No recorded pedestrian easement existed. No public access agreement had ever been filed. No document granted the homeowners association authority to direct residents across my land. The mediator quietly summarized the issue in a sentence that seemed to settle the room all at once. Good intentions, he explained, could never replace recorded property rights. Karen nodded thoughtfully before sliding a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a written proposal stating that the homeowners association would formally notify every resident that my backyard remained private property and that all future pedestrian travel must remain on existing public sidewalks. The proposal also included an agreement to distribute updated neighborhood maps, clearly identifying the proper walking routes already available throughout the subdivision. In return, I agreed to continue maintaining my fencing, warning signs, and security cameras while allowing emergency responders access only if genuine emergencies ever required it. That condition had never been a problem because emergency services already possessed the legal authority they needed. Before leaving, Karen quietly apologized for assuming repeated public use somehow changed private ownership. I appreciated her honesty because apologies supported by changed behavior carried far more weight than carefully chosen words. As I drove home beneath clear afternoon skies, I noticed something small but meaningful. Every pedestrian I passed remained on the public sidewalk, following the route that had always existed. My backyard looked exactly as it had the week before, with 6 content geese wandering peacefully beside the pond. The difference was not the fence, the cameras, or even the warning signs. The real difference was that everyone finally understood those boundaries had always deserved the same respect as their own front doors. The agreement became official the following week after both sides signed the final documents, and the Homeowners Association distributed a detailed community notice explaining the updated policy. Every resident received a printed neighborhood map highlighting the existing public sidewalks and reminding everyone that private property boundaries deserve the same respect as any front door or fenced backyard. I never asked to read the notice before it went out because the legal language had already been reviewed during mediation, but several neighbors later stopped by to tell me they appreciated how clearly everything had been explained. Instead of creating more division, the notice quietly ended months of confusion with a few simple facts supported by recorded property documents. The change became visible almost immediately. The worn dirt path that had slowly formed across my lawn over several years began disappearing beneath fresh green grass after I reseeded the area. My flower beds finally remained undisturbed. The side gate stayed closed throughout the day, and the security camera notifications that had once arrived almost every afternoon gradually became rare. Most recordings now captured nothing more exciting than squirrels exploring the fence line, songbirds gathering near the pond, and my 6 geese wandering confidently across the yard exactly as they always had. One Saturday morning I noticed something that genuinely surprised me. A family walking toward the subdivision reached the corner where people had once turned toward my gate. Instead of stepping onto my property, the parents pointed toward the public sidewalk while explaining something to their children. The entire family continued along the designated path without even glancing at the shortcut. Watching that small moment from my porch reminded me that good examples spread just as easily as bad habits when people finally understood the reason behind them. A few days later, Karen Mitchell knocked on my front door using the proper entrance for the first time since we had met. She carried no folders, no official letters, and no meeting agenda. Instead, she brought a small basket containing homemade bread from a neighborhood charity event and thanked me for attending the mediation with patience instead of anger. She admitted the association had become so focused on what seemed convenient for the community that it had overlooked the basic principle that every homeowner expected the same respect for their own property. I accepted the gesture because genuine accountability deserved acknowledgement when it was followed by meaningful action. Before leaving, Karen looked toward the pond where the geese rested peacefully beneath the afternoon sun and laughed softly. She admitted she had expected the birds to be much larger after hearing so many dramatic stories from residents. I smiled and explained that the geese had never really been the issue. They simply behaved like geese protecting the place where they lived. The real lesson had always been about people making thoughtful choices before opening a gate that clearly did not belong to them. As summer gradually replaced spring, my backyard returned to the quiet routine I had always hoped to preserve. The vegetables flourished, the maple trees cast long afternoon shadows across healthy grass, and the geese continued their familiar patrols between the pond and the fence without unexpected interruptions. The warning signs remained exactly where I had installed them, not because I expected more trouble, but because they represented something larger than a simple instruction. They stood as a reminder that clear communication, careful preparation, and documented facts had accomplished what endless arguments never could. Respect had finally replaced assumption, and the neighborhood felt stronger because everyone understood exactly where cooperation ended and private ownership began. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing cool mornings, golden leaves drifting across the lawn, and the familiar sound of 6 content geese greeting each sunrise exactly as they always had. Standing on my porch with a warm cup of coffee, I realized how peaceful the property had become once everyone accepted something that should never have been questioned in the first place. The shortcut was gone. Fresh grass covered the old worn trail where hundreds of footsteps had once crossed my backyard. The side gate remained closed unless invited guests used it properly, and the security cameras that had once documented daily trespassing now mostly recorded deer wandering along the fence after sunset, rabbits exploring the vegetable garden at dawn, and the geese confidently patrolling their home without interruption. Every so often, I opened the archive camera folders stored on my computer, not because I expected another disagreement, but because those recordings reminded me how quickly assumptions could replace facts when nobody stopped to ask the right questions. Months earlier, people believed my backyard existed for everyone's convenience simply because enough individuals had repeated the same behavior. In the end, recorded property boundaries, respectful communication, and simple documentation quietly restored the truth without anyone needing to raise a voice. One afternoon, I noticed Karen Mitchell walking along the public sidewalk during her regular neighborhood inspection. As she approached my property, she paused outside the fence and waved. I returned the gesture, and for a brief moment, both of us looked toward the pond where the geese floated peacefully beneath the reflection of bright autumn trees. There was no awkwardness between us anymore because the disagreement had already served its purpose. It reminded an entire community that respect begins where another person's property line starts. Before continuing down the sidewalk, Karen smiled and jokingly said she had learned to admire the neighborhood's most dedicated security team. I laughed, looked toward the geese, and admitted they had simply been doing the same job they had always done. They protected the place they called home without understanding anything about homeowners associations, legal documents, or neighborhood politics. The only people who needed to change were the ones reading the warning signs. As winter slowly approached once again, I prepared the yard the same way I always had by repairing fences, cleaning the pond, stacking firewood, and making certain the geese had everything they needed before the colder weather arrived. Life returned to the comfortable routine I had hoped to preserve from the beginning. Friends visited through the front gate after calling ahead. Neighbors stayed on the sidewalks built for everyone to enjoy. Children occasionally stopped outside the fence just to watch the geese wander through the grass, always smiling before continuing on their way. Looking across the quiet backyard one evening as the last light disappeared behind the trees, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving that I was legally right. The greatest victory was showing that patience, preparation, and documented truth could solve a conflict far more effectively than anger ever could. The warning sign still stood beside the gate exactly where I had installed it months earlier. Most people barely noticed it anymore because nobody tried opening the gate without permission. In the end, the sign was never really meant to keep good neighbors away. It simply reminded everyone that real communities are built when people respect one another's boundaries just as carefully as they expect others to respect their own. And every morning, as 6 remarkably observant geese wandered across the dew-covered grass, they quietly confirmed that some lessons never needed another reminder once they had finally been learned.